It is perhaps the most iconic firearm of the 20th century, the Thompson submachine gun. A Chicago typewriter in the hands of gangsters, a trench broom for the first GIs. It was a symbol of American industrial might, precision, and power. And yet, for the largest war in human history, it was a profound failure. Now, let's access the field logs and analyze the true nature of this story. This is a story of paradox. The Thompson M1928 and its later M1 variant. These were weapons of a bygone era, milled from solid steel. They featured beautiful wooden furniture and precise, complex internals. They were, in essence, finely crafted instruments of war. But that craft was a liability. When we analyze the production logs from 1941, the truth becomes clear. Each Thompson was a masterpiece of subtraction, of material carved away. It required dozens of complex machining operations, skilled labor, and precious time. In 1941, a single Thompson cost the government over $200, the equivalent of nearly $4,000 today, an astronomical price for a single infantry weapon. This was unsustainable. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had thrust America into a global conflict. An army of millions was being raised, and it needed to be armed immediately. The Thompson was not just expensive, it was a logistical bottleneck. Every Tommy gun produced was one less rifle, one less mortar, one less artillery piece. A new philosophy was required. The British had their simple, crude Sten gun. The Germans were developing their own revolutionary machine pistol. These weapons were built not by gunsmiths, but by auto body presses. America, the arsenal of democracy, was being outproduced by a weapon it considered a masterpiece. A replacement was needed, and it needed to be the Thompson's absolute antithesis. It couldn't be beautiful, it just had to work. The task fell not to a traditional firearms manufacturer, but to General Motors. Specifically, to a brilliant mechanic named George Hyde at their Inland division. His solution was not a gun in the traditional sense. It was a tool of pure, unadorned industrial efficiency. It was the T-20 prototype, and when adopted in 1943, it became the submachine gun caliber .45 M3. The troops who received it had a different name, the grease gun. The name was a perfect fit. The M3 looked like it belonged in an auto repair shop. It had no finely milled steel, no polished wooden stock. It was two halves of stamped sheet metal, welded together like a car fender. The charging handle itself was a simple crank, later replaced by a finger hole in the bolt. It was, by every metric, crude. But when we analyze the production data, the crude design reveals its genius. Where the Thompson cost over $200, the M3 cost the government just $20. It eliminated dozens of complex machining steps, replacing them with simple stamping and welding. This was not just a weapon. It was a triumph of logistics, a gun that could be produced in overwhelming numbers. But cheapness means nothing without effectiveness, and this is where the M3's ugly exterior hides its second, crucial secret. The legendary Thompson fired at a blistering 700 to 800 rounds per minute. It was a rate of fire that was violent, difficult to control, and devoured ammunition. In the hands of a nervous recruit, an entire 30-round magazine could be emptied in under 3 seconds. George Hyde, however, designed the M3 with a heavy, slow-moving bolt, resulting in a rate of fire of only 450 rounds per minute. This was not a design flaw. It was a tactical masterstroke. The M3 did not bark. It had a distinctive thumping chug-chug-chug sound. When we analyzed the field reports, this slow cycle provided a massive advantage. The gun was incredibly stable with minimal muzzle climb. A soldier could easily squeeze off single shots or precise two-round bursts. This transformed its battlefield role. It wasn't a trench broom for wild, suppressive fire. It was a controllable, accurate weapon for close-quarters combat. It conserved precious .45 ACP ammunition, a round it shared with the M1911 pistol. This ugly $20 tube of stamped steel was, ironically, a more precise instrument than the $200 masterpiece it was built to replace. But on paper, to the soldiers, it just looked cheap. It would have to earn its reputation, not in a factory, but in the frozen mud of battle. In December 1944, the German army launched its last desperate offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. It was a trial by ice, fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. And it was here that the Thompson's precision became its final, fatal flaw. The finely milled tolerances that made it a masterpiece in a factory made it a liability in the field. Oil congealed in the sub-zero cold. Mud and ice forced their way into its complex bolt, jamming the action solid. Soldiers reported having to build small fires just to thaw their weapons enough to chamber a round. But two groups already had the answer: U.S. armored crews and paratroopers. When we analyze their needs, we see they were the specialized forces who suffered most from the Thompson's design. For a tanker inside a Sherman, the Thompson was a long, heavy, awkward club. It snagged on equipment. It was impossible to aim from the ports, and it was a nightmare to bail out with. For the paratroopers, it was a burden. The men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne had to jump with the 11-pound weapon strapped to their bodies. Both of these groups were among the very first to be issued the M3 grease gun. And in the Ardennes, its perceived weaknesses became its greatest strengths. The M3's crude, loose tolerances, once a sign of its cheapness, meant it simply did not care about the cold. It cycled. Its simplicity was its armor. It had fewer parts to break, fewer tight spaces for ice to form. Its collapsing wire stock made it the perfect personal defense weapon for a tank crew. A paratrooper could jump with it collapsed, a compact piece of steel ready for action the moment his boots hit the snow.
We gotta move. Keep pushing
In the
forward.
foxholes around Bastogne, the $20 grease gun was proving decisively superior to the $200 Legend. When a tanker bailed out of his burning Sherman, he wasn't grabbing a beautifully blued weapon. He was grabbing the tool that worked. It was ugly, it was basic, but it was, above all, reliable. The M3 had passed its trial by fire, or rather, by ice. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the great arsenal of democracy began to take inventory. The Thompson, the pre-war legend, was one of the first items to be declared obsolete. It was too expensive to manufacture, too complex to maintain, and too heavy for modern warfare. It was moved to long-term storage, a celebrated relic whose time had passed. Its story, effectively, was over. But the grease gun remained. This is the final and perhaps greatest paradox of its story. The weapon that was dismissed as a cheap, disposable wartime expedient was the one the modern U.S. Army chose to keep. The M3 was simply too practical, too reliable, and too cost-effective to replace. The Thompson was an expensive specialist's weapon. The M3 was a ubiquitous, practical item of issue, like a helmet or a bayonet. And so it endured. When American forces were rushed to the Pusan perimeter to halt the invasion of South Korea, the M3 and M3A1 were the standard submachine guns issued to NCOs and armored crews. A decade later, in the jungles of Vietnam, it served again. Often suppressed, it became a quiet, reliable tool for special forces and reconnaissance units. The decades rolled on. The 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s. While the M16 became the standard rifle, the grease gun held its place. It was the personal defense weapon tucked inside the cramped confines of M60 tanks, and later the M1 Abrams. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, some U.S. armored crews were still issued the M3A1 as their primary defensive firearm. A weapon designed in 1942 was serving on the digital battlefield of the 1990s. This is the M3's true legacy. The Thompson is the gun we remember from the movies. It is the icon, the symbol, the polished legend. But when we access the field logs, we find a different, more practical truth. The legend was a logistical failure, a beautiful dead end. The grease gun, the cheap, ugly $20 tool, is the weapon that truly defined American industrial pragmatism and battlefield reliability. It was not a masterpiece. It was something far more important. It was a solution that, without fanfare, served for over 50 years. History, we find, is often a battle between perception and utility. The objects we celebrate are rarely the ones that do the heavy lifting of progress. The true story of victory is not always found in the polished and the perfect, but in the pragmatic, the sufficient, and the reliable. It is a lesson written not in gleaming steel, but in the simple, effective tools that, in the end, get the job done.